Well, this week is the COP26 conference, which is the latest gathering of the global elite, where they talk about how terrible climate change is and how these carbon emissions must be stopped. And, I talked about the problems of the green agenda last week and how ridiculous it is and how it's just going to make everybody poorer. But, it was so naive of me. I didn't really even address in my opinion, the certainty that what this is all about. Obviously, if you understand the facts of it, it has nothing to do with the actual climate or the environment or whatever. That is a very thin pretense. We all know that politicians are high time preference individuals, the most high time preference individuals in society. They care about the future 2 years from now when they have to get reelected. That's about it. They don't have, long-term time horizons, or else they wouldn't, run up $30 trillion in debt. And so we know that the reason why politicians care about this, it's because of their immediate interests. And the immediate interests that they're serving, or that this serves, I think, is just raw power. And I'll get deeper into that. But, doing things like criticizing the hypocrisy, for example, of Joe Biden's, I think, 85-car motorcade through the streets of Glasgow on the way to this summit thing. The fact that every time, one of the global elite gets on their either their private jet or their full airliner that they have dedicated themselves, like Joe Biden, the president of the United States, has a 747, biggest jet in the world. Well, not biggest passenger jet in the world. It's not a what are those real big cargo jets called? C-17 or a C-5? I can't remember. It's not as big as that, I don't think, but it's about as darn big as you can get. Emits more in one flight than probably thousands and thousands and thousands of Americans ever would, driving around in their SUVs that we're told are so evil. And people love to point out that hypocrisy, but that hypocrisy doesn't matter. The elite don't care. It's not about the amount of carbon that's being emitted. It's who's doing the emission. It's who's emitting that carbon. It's who that benefits. And ultimately, the emission of all that carbon, what that is tied to, what's the common thread? It's that it enriches ordinary people. It raises the standard of living of ordinary people. It creates wealth for ordinary people. The Industrial Revolution lifted humanity out of serfdom. That's why we're no longer serfs. It's basically because of industrialization. The Industrial Revolution created so much excess goods. It created so much wealth that a very small percentage of the population now has to be engaged in the production of food. And so that leaves, the vast majority of the human race left to spend their time doing things that, enrich our lives in other ways. They're able to build cars, which will carry us, across the country. They're able to develop entertainment, which will, give us some added enrichment to our leisure time. They're able to invent all sorts of new products, which make our labor more potent, which help us do more work with less effort. And all of this, going back to the earliest days of the Industrial Revolution in England, has been powered by carbon, by fossil fuels, by coal, by oil. Carbon is what fuels human prosperity, and it's what, if you look at industrialization, it has a pretty close correlation with the downfall of the entrenched elites, of the aristocracies, and the divine right, well, I shouldn't say divine right necessarily, but the strong hereditary monarchies, not only in Europe, but across the world. And the average person today, even though there's there's an infinitely higher number of laws and restrictions on human liberty today than there was 200 years ago, 250, 300 years ago, people are still much freer now than they were back then. again, not in a legal sense, but they're freer in a material sense, in that there is so much prosperity and so much surplus in our society that a lot more people can choose what they want to do with their lives. There's a lot less people on this planet who are worried about where their next meal is going to come from. Now, there are still people who are, but it used to be that was the default concern for almost everyone on the planet, except for, the top tenth of, the 1% elite. The very small, number of people who are in the clergy, or who were, landed aristocracy or members of the royal family. Those were the only people who didn't have to worry about eating, where their next meal would come from. Everyone else was dirt poor, literally. They had to work in the dirt to try and grow potatoes or wheat, corn, just to survive. And the elite has never been able to recover the disparity in power that they had over people back then. But if we were able to deindustrialize, at the very least, the Western world, the Western elite would, in relative terms, even if they became poorer in absolute terms, in relative terms, they would gain much greater leverage over the peasants beneath them. They would be much more able to reduce these people to a serf-like status. And so I think it's time that people, instead of trying to either ignore, the climate change catastrophism, or just make fun of it, or criticize the hypocrisy of it all, people need to be open and assert the fact that at this point, it appears like this is just a power grab. That's the only logical explanation. The elite hate you. They want you to be poor because then they can better control you. This is an idea that is pretty broadly accepted in certain contexts. I mean, just ask any of your average Republican voter what the Great Society was about back in the 1960s. Most of them, to the extent that they, remember that history or that they know anything about it, will tell you, oh, well, Lyndon Johnson was trying to keep blacks impoverished and incentivize broken homes so that the Democratic Party could create a permanent underclass who would always vote for them. And so the green agenda is very much like the Great Society in that sense, but on a global scale. It's not targeted at some racial minority in one major country. It's targeted at the entirety of the human population, at least the entirety of the Western population, where people seem to be most gung-ho about this. And so the reason why they want to go after carbon is not because it's a pollutant. It isn't. Carbon is not bad. Carbon is, building block of life. They want to cap carbon, they want to tax carbon, they want to reduce carbon because it is directly correlated with human prosperity. If you reduce carbon, if you cap carbon, if you lower carbon so-called emissions, you are going to lower and handicap wealth in your society. You're going to make your people poorer and more dependent on patronage from the elites. You're going to make their people's existence much more tenuous. They're not going to have as much wiggle room. They're not going to have as much breathing room between them and starvation. And so that's what this is all about. It's carbon for me and not for thee. The reason they want to cap these things so that they only have access to them. And again, even if they have less access in absolute terms, in relative terms, they'll be much better off than you are. So all the elites will still get their jets. That will all be under the cap because, they're such a small percentage of the population. We can emit carbon and not have it be, a threat to this, super spooky, global warming problem. Which in and of itself, again, you can argue from that angle, it's not even a problem. They have such a weak argument that they haven't even articulated what it is they're trying to avoid, that they magically think that they can avoid, why it's such a bad thing. If the Earth got warmer, then there's huge sections of the Earth that are uninhabitable because they're so cold. If the Earth got warmer, we would have more places that we could live on this planet. We would have longer growing seasons, and the planet could support a larger population. But they're not even showing that there's going to be a significant amount of warming on the planet. They don't even claim that. And so really, no matter what angle you tackle this as, it's incredibly weak, it's destructive, and at the end of the day, the global elite and their pawns want to destroy and deindustrialize and reduce people back to the level of serfs in terms of wealth for no good reason other than because we say it's the right thing to do. They want you nailed down. They want you unable to drive your car wherever you want. They want to make that prohibitively expensive, whether that's through insurance, or whether that's through the price of oil, or whether that's through the price of vehicles themselves, which only goes up and up and up and up, partially, or I should say largely, due not only to just general inflation, but to the increasingly tight regulations on how cars can be produced. And we have no real competition in the auto market anyway. Domestically, it'd be impossible to try and start a new competitor to somebody like Ford or Chrysler or GM. The big three have been the big three for a long time, and it was through state and corporate collusion that they came to be the big three. But I don't have time to get into that. But the more expensive it is, the less people have access to it, and therefore the less freedom of mobility people have in a real sense. And ultimately, they want everyone to be forced to use some electric Uber to get everywhere they want to go, or better yet, some kind of subway system which locks you into a fairly tight range. And if you want to, go to different places or wherever, your every movement will be tracked through big data. Gone will be the days of driving your own car without any sort of GPS tracking in it, without any Bluetooth computer that's connected to cell towers that pings everywhere you go. Paying for your gas with cash. It will be impossible. Again, in this one example of just driving a car, they want to make that impossible. At every turn, no matter how you examine this, so-called climate change issue, it always results in more power for the worst people on this planet. Magically, every one of their so-called solutions to this problem that we're not even sure is a problem and that likely is not a real problem, it might even be a good thing if it's actually happening as they say it is. I think it would be a good thing if this planet got warmer. Somehow every one of the solutions is extremely negative for ordinary people and extremely positive for the elite class. The entire burden of avoiding climate catastrophe is borne by the average person. And so regular people need to push back up against that and demand that no, we will not be limited on how much carbon we can emit or consume. Carbon is what gives us energy. It's what generates wealth. And this is what we're going to use until other forms of energy become cheaper. Because at a certain point, if solar technology gets good enough, I don't think the wind thing will ever really take off. They kill too many bald eagles. But the solar thing, that's quite promising. Batteries have gotten a lot better in the last, few years. Eventually, I think solar will be cheap enough. It'll make sense. Because once you have the solar system installed, it's free energy, right? You just have to maintain the system. So that will take off eventually. But they don't want that to happen organically. Because if that happens organically, people will have access to free energy. They'll be even freer. They will be even less reliant on the centralized power grid, and there will be no real way for the state to tax that or to control that or to cut off people's electricity. I believe, I'm trying to remember, I think it was the mayor of Los Angeles wanted to use public utilities as a way of enforcing social distancing. People who had too many people over at their house, he'd cut the power or cut the water off so that everybody would want to leave. They don't want you to live off the grid and have your own ways of generating power, having your own mode of transportation, having your own way of generating electricity, having your own ways of connecting with other people and communicating outside of their framework. And we will never be able to resist this onslaught until people start to realize this and to accept it. You must accept that anyone who can be considered a quote-unquote world leader is generally speaking going to be your enemy. Anyone who is in the good graces of the World Economic Forum or the G7 or the folks attending this COP26 conference, all of them very bad guys. No matter whether they are supposedly on the left or the right, this is something that completely transcends the left-right spectrum, has nothing to do with it. You've got Boris Johnson, who's supposed to be on the right. You've got Joe Biden, who's supposed to be on the left. They're 100% simpatico on this. Hell, they have the same campaign slogan, Build Back Better. And, of course, to finish off, what better cliche could I end with than George Carlin's old quote, "It's a big club, and you're not in it."